Hey Hillside, Pastor Eric here. This Sunday we just started our new sermon series, Blessed to be a Blessing, on the topic of biblical stewardship and giving. We're going to be producing two more of these videos next week and the week after as we go through this series, just to hopefully bless you more, to hopefully gain some more insight to grow deeper into this topic. But also, I had mentioned at church that I was going to a Doctor of Ministry residency in June through Massachusetts at Gordon Conwell. And part of the requirement of my time there is to go through this course called Biblical Stewardship Principles. And one of the requirements of that course is to actually present the material that I learned in that course in an accessible way to Hillside. And I thought, what more accessible way to do that than to preach on the subject and then provide these throughout the week. So what you're really getting here is Gordon Conwell helping me practice the very thing I'm asking you to step into, which is Gordon Conwell has blessed me with this curriculum, truly blessed me, and I'm hoping to give it to you now so that it can be a blessing to you as it has been to me. So this past Sunday, we talked about how God, who owns everything, generously provides so that we can flourish and so that we can bless others. And we spent 99% of our time moving through the creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2 to really talk about God's ownership and how he does own everything. And right at the end of the sermon, I alluded to this video and gave a brief snapshot about how God's generosity is seen throughout the rest of the Old Testament. So we certainly hit home on the subject of God's ownership, of God's generosity, but I would encourage you to go look at the service if you want to kind of take a deeper dive into it. It's on YouTube. But for this video, I want to take a step back and look at the topic of stewardship as a whole. And not just the generosity element, but this series, Blessed to be a Blessing, is at the end of the day trying to cultivate our hearts and minds more to be faithful biblical stewards. And so in a couple weeks, I'm going to be talking about the practicals and maybe the to-dos that I might challenge you to practice yourself in your daily life. But this week, I want to take a look at the bigger picture. And specifically, we want to look at the bigger picture of the Old Testament. And I'm going to do my best to walk through 39 books in the Old Testament. Don't worry, it won't be that long. And credit to Dr. Gary Hogue and the content from his Faith and Finances Stewardship curriculum for churches and for schools. But using his help, I want to try and walk you through 39 books in the Old Testament real quick and point out 7 themes that we see consistently in the Old Testament as it relates to stewardship. And these 7 themes that we see throughout the narrative of the Old Testament ultimately help us gain insight for how we are to relate to God, to each other, and material wealth as faithful biblical stewards. So these are the 7 themes that we see. And the first one is what we talked about on Sunday in the account of creation. All of creation shouts of God's generosity. All he created, he declared was good. All of it he owns. He gave it to us as his humans, as his image bearers, and as his stewards. And so that's what we talked about this Sunday, that it's all God's to begin with. Everything. He created everything. He owns it. And as we think about what it means to be a faithful biblical steward, that is the foundation we all have to start with. Okay, but the second theme is the purpose of provision. That word provision, that God even provides in the first place. As faithful biblical stewards, what does the Old Testament tell us about God's provision? Well, it tells us that God blesses mankind, not so that we can be fat and happy, but so that we can be a faithful conduit, a channel of God's blessings to others. And we see this most clearly in the patriarchs, with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, with Joseph. God blessing them, not just with family and promise, but with resources. And we see them not hoarding it, but actually distributing it to the people and making sure that others were blessed. We see it with Moses too. When they get out into the desert, God continues to provide, but there's some rules and restrictions with the manna. Don't take more than you need. And for the people who can't get it, he says, here's some extra, and you bring it back to them. The Old Testament clearly shows us we're not to take what God has given to us and hoard it past our own means. If we have all we need, then consider that the extra that we have might be a blessing to others. The third theme is what we see in the instructions in the law, right? This is where we get to sort of the nitty-gritty, the explicit instructions for what faithful Old Testament biblical stewards should look like, or New Testament general stewards. And what God's law says is things like give your first fruit of your crops, of your cattle, 10% commandment. God says take 10% of all you have and set it aside for me because it's his in the first place. But we also see a couple other 10% mandates. The first one is with the festivals in Deuteronomy 14. And they're really supposed to be set aside so that there can be food to enjoy when the festivals come. They don't have to scrape it all up at the same time. And then the third tenth we're seeing is give it to the Levites, the pastors of the time, but also give it to them so they can distribute it to the poor. Really what we see in the law is that if God's people were to follow his law, the livestock would continue to reproduce, the bread would rise, and they would be able to prosper and be channels of God's blessings to everyone else. Generosity was the glue that held them, the community, together. And if we can see God's law like that today, I think it would change the way we see our giving. These are not rules to make sure we can't have as much fun, but the more we give and the more we are faithful to God's standards as faithful biblical stewards, it holds the community together. The fourth theme we see is really from the historical books. It's sort of like a case study, right? Good, faithful biblical stewards as kings look like this. The bad ones look like this. The good one we see is King David, right? King David, he was the definition of what a faithful biblical steward looks like. He knew God owned everything. He used his blessing to bless others, but he was also a good king in that he made sure the people practiced good generosity practices. And then we see with the other kings that they used their blessings not only to turn away from God, but the way that they steward led other people away from God. And what we can see when they eventually went into exile is it wasn't a good outcome. Right? So it's important to follow God's biblical standard. Then when we move into the perspective from the wisdom literature, you know how you learn things sometimes where it's like, this is good wisdom, I'll learn from that. That's what the wisdom literature is. It's that side of the coin that says these are generally good practices, time and true, tested all the time. If you do these, it's probably going to work out well for you. Things like handle money with care. Debt is limiting. That any time that we enter into a debt, we are essentially, the borrower is entering into slavery with the lender. And that wealth is meant ultimately to be, again, a conduit, a channel, not for luxury, not for sitting around. So we learn from good wisdom, but then there's the other side of the coin, which is I learned from something that I should not do or thing that's really bad. And that's what we get with the assessment of the prophets. Here's what faithful biblical stewardship does not look like. And the prophets were able to define that by just looking around and seeing what was going on and saying, hey, this is not it. Get your house in order because God sees what you're doing, how you're stewarding his blessings, and it's not just unwise, but it's harmful and dangerous. In Hosea 2, we see God saying, you took God's blessing and you gave it to another God. That is the worst possible thing you can do with God's blessings. And Jeremiah and Ezekiel says you've been using unjust measures in your business practices. And you've been cheating people, not because you need to survive, but out of your greed. Micah, he says you've sacrificed, yes, you've given to God, but your hearts are far from God. And that's something we're going to be talking about more this Sunday. But we should read the prophets and see them as a warning, a litmus test that says if we can test our own stewardship practices against, because by using the prophets, God says this is really not what good stewardship looks like. And then the final theme that we see, and it shouldn't be surprising, it fits well with what we talked about on Sunday, is that God will keep on being generous, right? And the best and the most amazing promise he gives us is the promise of a Messiah, of Jesus. And where this is important in the context of stewardship and giving is that God intended for Israel to follow his word, his law, his wisdom when it came to giving. But as we see, the effects of sin in our lives make it impossible for us to hold the community together, even our own hearts in right standing with God. We're not very good at that all the time. But in Isaiah 61, we see this is the help that we'll get outside of ourselves. And in Isaiah 61, it says, someday good news will be proclaimed to the poor. Now, why is that important in this context? When God's people followed God's instructions, they were a conduit of blessing to the world, and if the poor didn't suffer, it meant that God's people were being faithful biblical stewards. If the poor suffered, it meant that they weren't following God's way and God's will and law. But the promise is that one day God's going to make it all right by sending Jesus. He is the one that is able to hold the community together, our hearts together. And so maybe a final word of encouragement on that note is that when it comes to stewardship, giving, really any area of our lives, what we see from these 7 themes and some practical wisdom that we can take away and apply to our lives today is first, God is in control from beginning, middle, and end. God created it, God gives it, and when we mess it all up, the only person who can come up and put it all back together is God. He's in control from beginning to end, so have and put your faith in him. And then the second thing is really two parts. We would be wise to follow God's word when it comes to the topic of stewardship in our lives, because first, start with the bad news. God shows us that we're going to be accountable. That bad stewardship has consequences, but that good stewardship has blessings. And we ought to really, really consider that in our lives today. But second, we would be wise because if we are faithful to God's word, we actually don't need to work as hard for the things that we're working for in the first place. The reason we gain resources and money is so that we can have peace, contentment, food, clothes. God says, I'm going to take care of all of it. We don't need to be clever. We don't need to work those extra hours all the time. God set the whole thing into motion and said, here are my giving instructions so that you can be held together in mutual love and generosity. This Sunday, I look forward to talking to you about what it is that God really wants when it comes to giving, and you may be surprised to know it actually has nothing to do with money. And then next week, we'll follow up that sermon with a look through the New Testament themes and how it informs our biblical stewardship. And it'll be shorter than last week because you won't have to hear all the explanation for why we had to do this in the first place. But if you made it to the end, thank you for watching. Hope to see you on Sunday in worship with you. God bless.